Capitalism is a system where production is organized for profit. It is the system of production for profit, where the banks and the factories and the industries and the centers of economic power are operating as the private property of owners, and the owners are using them to maximize profits for themselves. That's what capitalism is. Capitalism is production organized for profit. Capitalism moved toward the stage of imperialism starting in the 1890s. We entered the stage of capitalism called imperialism, capitalism in its monopolistic stage. And imperialism is a form of capitalism in which gigantic corporations based in the Western countries hold back development around the world. And that's capitalism in its monopolistic stage. In regular capitalism, the capitalist makes profits and the worker is exploited to make those profits. In imperialism, the Western capitalists make super profits, and the workers of the colonized world are super exploited. Imperialism is entire nations becoming dominated by the power of Western banks and Western corporations. Imperialism is Mexico having its agricultural sector destroyed by NAFTA, and the people in Mexico having grown their own food since before Christopher Columbus showed up. But now all the Mexican farms have been destroyed, the farming sector has been shut down, and they import their food from American agribusiness corporations. Imperialism is Nigeria, a country with a huge amount of oil. The Niger Delta region in Nigeria is full of oil. It's got a very valuable natural resource. So much wealth exists in Nigeria of this very valuable commodity called oil. But the people of Nigeria are impoverished. They have a low life expectancy, a low rate of literacy. A lot of them don't have running water or electricity in their homes. Why is a country with so much oil so poor? It's poor because that oil is in the hands of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. The export of capital. Big corporations in the Western countries control the natural resources of Nigeria. The raw materials, the natural wealth of this African country is not in the hands of the African people. It is in the hands of a Western monopolistic corporation. And because of that, a whole nation called Nigeria that includes workers, includes peasants, includes small business owners, includes capitalists, that whole nation is impoverished. That's imperialism. At one point, India was a colony of the British Empire. And when India was a colony of the British Empire, what did the British Empire do? They went to a people who'd been weaving and had huge looms. They'd been weaving for thousands of years, and they burned the looms down. And they forced the proud people of India to import their cloth from Britain to secure a monopoly for the British textile industry. You know about Gandhi. What was Gandhi's big act of civil disobedience? What was it that Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian independence fighter, did? What was his big act of civil disobedience? He boiled seawater. That's what Gandhi did. That was his big act of defiance, is he got seawater and he boiled it to make his own salt. And then he would sit in front of the police, this little guy. He got a big jug of salt water and he put it on top of a fire and he lit a fire underneath it and he boiled salt water and the police arrested him. Why? Because there was a monopoly on salt by a British corporation, and making his own salt was illegal. It was a violation of the property rights of this British corporation that had a monopoly. Well, Gandhi, as an Indian nationalist, wanted India to make its own salt. And that's what imperialism is. It's very similar to in Bolivia. In Bolivia, It was until the rise of Evo Morales and until the rise of the anti-imperialist movement there. In the 1990s in Bolivia, it was a crime to collect rainwater on your roof. If you had a jug on the roof of your house, you collected rainwater, that was a crime because you were stealing from Nestle and Coca-Cola and the Western corporations that owned the water of Bolivia. The water of Bolivia had been privatized and turned into the private property of American corporations, and Bolivians were arrested if they collected rainwater on their roof. That's imperialism. Imperialism is gigantic corporations based in Western countries spreading out all over the world and crushing development and keeping people in poverty and preventing entire nations from building up and developing their resources, but rather using them as captive markets to be controlled. That is what imperialism is. Imperialism is monopolistic capitalism. It is the export of capital. It is the emergence of an international financial oligarchy. And that is what we live under in our time. We don't live under the dictatorship of a guy who owns a bar in your neighborhood. We don't live under the dictatorship of my pillow. My name is Mike Lindell, and I think Trump had the election stolen from him. My pillow. We don't live under the dictatorship of my pillow. We don't live under the dictatorship of Joe, the bar owner in your neighborhood. We don't live under the dictatorship of a small-time landlord that owns 2 buildings. We live under the dictatorship of international bankers, an international financial oligarchy. We live under the dictatorship of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, Bank of America, Chase, JP Morgan Chase. We live under the dictatorship of the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, the HSBC Bank. We live under the dictatorship of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates. We live under the dictatorship of the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Carnegies. We live under the dictatorship of Jamie Dimon. We live under the dictatorship of the Rothschilds and the Carnegies and the Mellons. We live under the dictatorship, the international financial oligarchy of bankers and ultra monopolies. That is what we live under, and it's called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And Vladimir Lenin wrote a very, very good book about it, which I recommend you all read. It's called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. We live under monopolistic capitalism. We live under the dictatorship of huge monopolistic corporations, and the main way they keep their wealth is by keeping people in poverty. That is the main way they maintain their wealth and power. It is by keeping people in poverty. They don't maintain their wealth by helping people get out on their own. No. They don't maintain their wealth by helping nations industrialize. No. They maintain their wealth by impoverishing the world and holding back development. This is what you need to understand. This is a concept that is key, because there's a lot of confusion about this out there. People think socialism is and capitalism is that somebody owns the factory and somebody works in the factory, and that's no fair. That's not the world we live in at this time. There is a contradiction between employers and employees. That is true. That exists in the labor movement, and the struggle of workers for representation and rights on the job is an important thing, but that is not the era that we live in. We don't live in the era of factory owners oppressing factory workers. We live in the era of huge monopolistic corporations holding back development and keeping entire nations in poverty. That is what we live in. We live in the era of imperialism, monopolistic capitalism. This is very, very important to understand. Very, very important to understand because there's a lot of confusion about it. And if you just go back and read Marx, you're going to get confused on this point. And if you go back and you stick with the old classical communist contradiction, you're going to be very confused on this point. But starting in the 1890s, we entered the stage of monopolistic capitalism. Marx thought that the socialist revolutions would happen in the West, in Germany, in France, places like that, and he was wrong. And Marx thought that socialist revolution would happen on the basis of workers in factories rising up against their employers. And he was also wrong. He was wrong on that point as well. Socialism has come into the world as a result of entire nations breaking free from imperialism. That is how socialism has come into the world. It's that those corporations based in Western countries spread their tentacles all over the world, and they started oppressing entire nations. And as a result, in order for those countries to be free, a mass movement had to be created. And that mass movement, at the center of it, had the working class, had the peasantry, and that mass movement created a centrally planned economy in order to help the country develop. Let me tell you something. I talk about Lenin a lot. I talk about the Bolsheviks. I talk about all that history a lot. But there are things about it that people don't understand. And I think this is the first thing you need to understand. The Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Party, was formed in 1903 in London. Vladimir Lenin was a Russian guy who'd been a leader of various Marxist and socialist groups, and he had fled from the country, and he was living in London in exile. And he had a meeting, a very small meeting. I think there was about 30 people there, maybe 50, but probably only 30. At this meeting, he pitched an idea for a completely new type of organization that had never existed before, a party of new type. And he said that this party of new type would engage in agitation and propaganda. Agitation would be messages designed to stir up the population to revolt, and propaganda would be a very, very sophisticated message of teaching the Marxist ideology to people that were ready to hear it. And he would build a party that would go out and find the agitators, the people in every workplace who are mad about the boss, the peasant who gets mad at the landlord. He said there's agitators everywhere. And he would go into the workplaces and he would go into the population and he would find the agitators. And the agitators would be recruited. And the agitators would be propagated to. They would teach this complex ideology, Marxism, to the agitators. And so they had a strategy of engaging in agitation to the masses and propaganda to the advanced and seeking out agitators, finding the people who just naturally are the troublemakers, the rebels, the rabble rousers, finding those people and making them full-time, giving them enough money that they could be full-time in their agitation and amplifying their agitation while teaching them a specific ideology. Their method would be agitation propaganda. And they would engage in democratic centralism, meaning that the whole group would say the same thing. They would have one newspaper that spoke for the group. They would have one message. They would have a lot of debate internally. But once they decided on something, the whole group would carry it out. They would keep their fights internal rather than external. They would have one face to the masses, and they would wrangle, they would argue with each other, but once a decision was made, every member was obligated to carry it out, whether they agreed or not. This was called democratic centralism. And Lenin, in a room with 30 people, pitched this idea of what he called a party of new type. A party of new type. And he said, we're going to form an organization that's completely different than any of the communist groups that has ever existed. We are going to launch a party of new type. And we're going to practice democratic centralism, and we're going to engage in agitation. We're going to find the agitators, and we're going to recruit them, and we're going to pay them so they're full-time agitators, and we're going to propagate to the advance. And he pitched this whole idea, and he had there was a meeting, and he sat down in 1903 with a group of people in exile, a group of Russian exiles. They had a meeting, and Lenin pitched this idea. He was going to form this party of new type. And the majority of the people in the room said, okay, we'll go along with it. And the minority of the people in the room said no and rejected it. And the word for majority or majority group in Russian is Bolshevik. And the word for minority group in Russian is Menshevik. And so the minority didn't go along with Lenin, and they were known as the Mensheviks. And the majority went along with Lenin, and they were known as the Bolsheviks. And that is the origin of the Bolshevik Party. And the Bolshevik Party, their real name was the Russian, there were two parties at that point. There was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, but there were different discussions. And so as a result of that meeting, you had the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parenthesis, Bolshevik, and then you had the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, parenthesis, Menshevik. And the Bolsheviks, as they were known, these people just started calling them the Bolsheviks, were considered to be freaks and weirdos. The global communist movement thought they were kooky. And this is a fact. The global communist movement looked at the Bolsheviks and they said, this is not our kind of group. This is a weird organization. This is a bunch of weirdos. This is not us. At the time, there was a huge Marxist party in Germany called the German Social Democratic Party. It was huge, led by Karl Kautsky, had millions of members, looked nothing like the Bolsheviks. There was the Labour Party in Britain, huge Marxist party in Britain, social democratic, the Labour Party. There were all kinds of French socialist groups. Everyone looked at the Bolsheviks and said, this is a wacky group. They said that the Bolsheviks looked more like a monastic order than like a political party. Did you know this? This is you can go and read it for yourself. They said the Bolsheviks, this isn't a political party. This is a monastic order. Now, what did they mean by monastic order? Well, at the time, the Catholic Church existed, and you had monks in the Catholic Church. You had Franciscans, and you had Jesuits, and they said, look, a political party is a group that has conventions, is a group that runs in elections, is a group that, has events to promote its ideas, is a group that is always debating and wrangling about which is the correct way to go. But these Bolsheviks, they don't look like a political party. They look like a monastic order because they all give the whole of their lives to the movement. Lenin called on his people who joined the Bolsheviks. He said, we want people who will give the whole of their lives to the movement. The whole of their lives. That's what he said. He said, I want a party of professional revolutionaries. He said, I don't want every university student to join our organization. No, I only want those who will give the whole of their lives. Our goal is not to increase membership. Our goal is to find the best and make them better and train them to be even better. That is our goal. Our goal is not for everybody, every university student who agrees with us to join. No, we only want those who are willing to give the whole of their lives. We want an organization of fanatics. We want an organization of people that are in this for real, that are down for the whole thing. That's what we want. That's what we want. And he formed a party of people who were willing to give the whole of their lives. And other people looked on and they said, this looks like a monastic order. And that was the early 1900s way of calling them a cult. That's what it was. That was more or less what it was. It was the, there wasn't talk of cults at that time, but people saw the Bolsheviks as a weird group, and the Bolsheviks' ideas shifted. And this is the important thing: they didn't sound like other Marxists. Marxism opposed nationalism of all types. There are no nations. It's just the workers and the bosses. Lenin says, no, actually, nationalism of the oppressed is a good thing. We want nations of oppressed people to break free from imperialism. We support the nationalism of people that are fighting against colonialism. That was a completely unacceptable view at that point. Marxists had opposed nationalism, had opposed all nations, the idea of a nation existing, etc. Nope, can't have it. Well, they came up with this new theory that we support nations. And he said, we're not fighting against regular capitalism. We're fighting against imperialism. Capitalism has entered this new phase called imperialism, which is the domination of the world by bankers, not factory owners. And we are fighting to build a movement against the rule of the bankers, against the bankers that are dominating the world. And we're fighting for whole nations to be free from the bankers. Lenin is saying we're fighting for whole nations to be free from the rule of the international bankers, right? If fascism had existed back then, they would have called him a fascist. They would have said, that's fascism. You're promoting nationalism. You're saying you want to defeat an international financial system. We're talking about workers and factory owners, and you're talking about whole nations being free, and you're talking about bankers. And that's what Leninism is. Leninism was a break with standard Marxism. Regular Marxists were not talking about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Regular Marxists were not talking about nationalism of the oppressed people being a good thing. Regular Marxists were forming debating societies and big clubs. As long as you agree with 5 points, you can join. And he was forming a group that called on people to give the whole of their lives. Lenin was doing something fundamentally different than what any of the global Marxist movement was doing at that time. And this is what people need to understand. Lenin was engaging in political innovation. He was not going along with the standard way of doing things. He was engaging in developing new methods and a new theory, a new type of organization, a new understanding of the world economy, a new tactical orientation. All of this was developed by Vladimir Lenin. It was innovation on a massive scale. It was a break. The global Marxist movement thought the Bolsheviks were a bunch of weirdos talking about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, this group that requires you to give the whole of your life to be in it. This is weird. They support nationalism. Everybody knows there's no nations. It's just the workers versus the bosses. Duh. Right? I mean, everything that Lenin was doing was a complete divergence from standard Marxism, and that was good. Thank God for that. Because if he hadn't done that, what would have happened? People don't seem to understand this. Leninism was a break with the global Marxist movement. And Lenin spoke about Kautsky, and he spoke about the global Marxist movement in angry, fiery terms. Lenin said the Second International was a stinking corpse, and he condemned it in fiery words. The reason they called themselves the Communist Party was because they didn't want anyone to think they were anything like the Social Democratic Party. They were a completely different thing. They looked different. They sounded different. They had different beliefs. They had a different ideology. This is what I'm trying to get you to understand. And if Lenin had just gone along with what people believed at the time, it would not have been what it was. Leninism was a complete divergence. And as somebody who has met Alexander Dugin, As somebody who has spent time in Russia, I must say this: Leninism was much less Western. Leninism was an Eastern adaptation. Marxism originated among the radical middle class of France and Germany and Britain. And it was the intellectuals and the students who were unsatisfied with the French Revolution. The French Revolution had promised to build an egalitarian society, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and it didn't achieve it. Right? It created a society full of injustice. And so people that were inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution, inspired by the aesthetic of the French Revolution, the red flag and the guillotine and the down with the oppressors, people that were in the mystique or the spiritual aspect of the French Revolution. People that were influenced by the attitudes of the French Revolution. And people who were part of what in 1848 was called the Spring of Nations, which was an uprisings all across Europe inspired by the French Revolution. Republicans, that's what they called themselves, people fighting for the creation of a democratic republic. Republicans throughout Europe that were inspired by the creation of a democratic republic, who wanted to make the ideals of the French Revolution come true. That's where Marxism and communism started. It was very Western. It was very middle class. It was very Eurocentric. It was people that were disappointed with the French Revolution, trying to figure out how they could make the French Revolution, make the dreams of Robespierre, make the dreams of Jean-Paul Marat come true. That's what Marxism started out as. Marx was a young Hegelian, a left Hegelian, and he wanted to make the French Revolution come true. And Bolshevism was the first step away from that. It was the first step out of Europe. And the party of new type was very similar to the secret societies that had existed throughout Russian history. In Russia, there were the old believers, people who, when the Russian Orthodox Church changed its rules and became very modern, held on to the old rules. And they were persecuted, and they had secret signs and gestures. The old believers, that's a big thing in Russia, right? The old believers had big beards, right? Because Russian Orthodox tradition is that men should have big beards. Well, when the Russian Orthodox Church changed its rules, some of these men wouldn't shave their beards, and they had a big crackdown on beards in Russia. And there was a punishment, a fine. If you were a man and you had a big beard, you had to pay a fine, right? The old believers were people in Russia who held on to the more esoteric beliefs and the more strict traditionalist conservative beliefs of the Russian Orthodox Church. They're called the old believers, and they were persecuted. They were burned at the stake. They had to pay fines for their beards and all of that, but they existed. That was part of the spiritual heritage that gave birth to the Bolshevik movement. There was also something called the Decembrists. And the Decembrists were a group of people who tried to overthrow Tsar Nicholas I during his coronation. They tried to have the military overthrow the Tsar. And it was a secret society that was formed. And the idea of conspiratorial secret societies that agitate the masses and influence the masses while operating internally with their very specific beliefs internally, this has been in Russian culture for thousands of years. But it's not Western. It's very Eastern. Right? You can argue that maybe it was inspired by Masonry, the Freemasons a little bit, but it was very Eastern. It was a very Eastern thing. And Lenin said, okay, you guys in the West, you've come up with Marxism, this philosophy that says we need a centrally planned economy. I get that. But I'm going to take Marxism and I'm going to make it Russian. And I'm going to adjust it to say we're not fighting regular capitalism, we're fighting imperialism. I'm going to adjust it to say that we support nations that are struggling for their national liberation, where it's not just workers against the bosses. I'm going to adjust it and say that we're going to build a monastic order, a secret society, which is in our culture. I am going to take these Marxist ideas that I got from Europe, and I am going to adjust them for Russian conditions. And I am going to develop socialism with Russian characteristics. I am going to develop a movement that will work here in our time that is different than the movement that currently exists. That's what Lenin did. And it bothers me, it frustrates me that people don't understand this. If Lenin had just copied what all of everybody was doing at the time, we would never have gotten Bolshevism. Bolshevism was a deviation. Bolshevism was a change. Bolshevism was a switch. Bolshevism adjusted. And Bolshevism was very defensive. It had to argue. And if you read the writings of Lenin, you read the Bolshevik literature, they're constantly arguing, yes, we are the real Marxists. Constantly. They're constantly saying, yes, we're the real Marxists. We're the real Marxists. And they have quotes from Lenin about the Irish freedoms, or quotes from Marx about the Irish freedom struggle, quotes from Marx about Poland and its struggle for independence. They're constantly on the defensive, saying that we're the real Marxists. And so if you just read that literature, you'll think, oh, well, they were just the real Marxists. But you're missing the point. Why did they have to say that? Why did they have to say that? They had to say it because they were so different in how they appeared and what they believed and what they advocated than the Western Marxist movement. They had to write endless pamphlets proving and explaining with quotes and all of that they were the true Marxists, because the majority of the Marxist movement sounded nothing like them, didn't believe the same things that they believed, didn't organize the same way that they operated. They were the black sheep, or I guess the white sheep, if you want to call it that, of European Marxism, okay? And I am emphasizing this point over and over and over again because I just want you to understand this, right? If you don't understand this aspect of Marxism, if you think that Lenin was just doing the same thing that Karl Marx was doing, you're wrong. And it's good that he didn't. And it makes sense that he would argue he was the true interpreter and all of that. But the movement that Lenin built was in opposition to the existing Marxist movement. It was completely different from the existing Marxist movement. It was more Russian. It was in favor of nationalism. It talked about imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And what was the big thing that Lenin did? I haven't even mentioned this part. The big thing that Lenin did that was different than all the other Marxists of his time is that he called for building a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and the peasants. Oh boy. Marxism says that it's the working class, the industrial factory worker, that is the class that's going to lead to advance. But Lenin looked at Russia and said, we don't have many of those people. The majority class in Russia is the peasantry. So the Bolsheviks, Marx had called for a dictatorship of the proletariat. And Lenin said, we can't have that in Russia because we don't have that many proletarians. And even the word dictatorship of the proletariat is not a great word, right? Because when we think of dictatorship, we think of guy in a military uniform yelling. We think of like Hitler or something. Dictatorship just means rule. Marx had written, we are fighting for the rule of the working class, the rule of the proletariat. Well, Lenin comes out and he says, we ain't for the rule of the proletariat because there ain't that many of them here. You know, we have a largely agrarian economy. So Lenin changed what Marx said about the dictatorship of the proletariat, and he replaced it with the slogan that the Bolsheviks had everywhere. If you asked them what they were for, the Bolsheviks said, we are for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. We are for a revolutionary government a government, the rule of the working class and the farming class, the peasantry, the workers and the farmers. We're for a worker and farmer government. We are for the rule of workers and farmers. The direct translation is the revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. No, you can't do that. It's only the working class that's advanced. Oh my God, peasants are a backward class. They all want to become capitalists. They all blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm telling you, Lenin was an innovator. And this is important to understand. And Bolshevism, as it emerged, and the Bolshevik movement that ultimately ended up taking power in Russia, why did it take power? Let's just talk about that. Why did the Bolsheviks take power? What did they do that enabled them to come to power? They got money from the Germans. I see people talking about the Federal Reserve and all of that. No. They mainly got financial backing from the Germans. Right? World War I was happening, and the Bolsheviks were against World War I. The sellout party, the Mensheviks, supported World War I. All the big Marxist parties in Europe all supported their own government in World War I. The Bolsheviks were against World War I, and the Germans were fighting the Russians in World War I. And it is a historical fact that the German intelligence, the German secret police, met with Lenin and gave Lenin lots of money and arranged for Lenin to come back to Russia because they wanted Russia to pull out of the war. And Lenin was the guy, the leader of the biggest anti-war organization. The Bolsheviks were this political group that Lenin had built, and they were huge, and they were against the war. And so the German secret police gave thousands of dollars, probably a lot more, to Vladimir Lenin and put him on a train and said, go back and build yourself an anti-war party. And Lenin came back to Russia on a sealed train with money from the Germans, and he dramatically changed the tactics of the Bolshevik Party with the April Thesis, where they completely changed the way they operated. They changed their name to the Communist Party, and they made opposing war the center of their activity. And that's how they came to power. And that's where the Soviet Union came from. And I'm telling you all of this because I want you to have perspective. I want you to have perspective. We're not trying to copy what they did. We're not saying that this is the model of what you should do. We're saying the opposite. We're saying that Bolshevism was political innovation. Bolshevism was adapting and adjusting and going in a whole new direction. That's what we're saying here. And that's what I would really like you to understand, that people don't seem to get that. That what got Lenin to the Finland station was his willingness to do things completely differently than the way other people were doing them. And I get frustrated because people don't understand that. People don't understand that he changed dictatorship of the proletariat to dictatorship of the workers and peasants. And I could go over all of it again, but Bolshevism was massive political innovation and change and adjustment. And no one in America had ever heard of the Bolsheviks until the Russian Revolution, because they were this weird group that had weird ways of doing things that were very, very Russian and very, very not Western. And I want you to understand that, because in our time, there is a very, very big need for political innovation. There's a very, very big need to change and break with the old way of doing things. There is a lack of innovative thinking there is an endless amount of dogmatism, there's an endless amount of tailism, and there's a lot of useless internet fandoms. And if we are going to save our country, the United States of America, from the crisis that it's in, and if we are going to build an anti-imperialist movement in America, we need to innovate, and we need to change, and we need to do things differently. And I get fired up about this because I see people making the same mistakes that have been made. And I see people acting a fool, and I get frustrated by it. And I just don't have it in me to go along with it. I just don't have it in me to let it be, to just let it happen. I just don't have it within my soul to let this go uncorrected. I am somebody who burns with passion. I am somebody who sees that imperialism is the main enemy of humanity. I am somebody who sees that the global anti-imperialist movement has changed and that Soviet-style Marxism is no longer the way these groups and the way the global anti-imperialist movement is operating. I am somebody who sees that millions of working people in this country are struggling. I mean, I see so many things that I cannot keep silent about. And I am determined to intervene in history. I do not believe that I am powerless. And I do not believe that history will just take its course, regardless of what we do. I believe in the power of the individual. I believe in the power of the human will. I believe in the power of our choices to make a difference. And when I see how our country is marching toward World War III and marching toward a low-wage police state at the same time, I see the urgent necessity of doing something about it. And not getting internet famous, but actually building a movement and doing something about it. And this needs to happen. We need to intervene in the historical process. It needs to happen. We need to intervene in history, and we need to get things done. We need to change the world. We urgently need to change the world. And, you know, life would be much easier for me and for a lot of people if I was capable of just going along with things as they are. But I am not. I am not. And I feel a need to share what I've learned with people. And I feel a need to try and make the world a better place. And, maybe that's a curse, but it's just something that needs to be done.